Thank you for coming out on one of our glorious end of the semester afternoons here in Ithaca, New York, for this afternoon's special lecture. This lecture and our visitors' time at Cornell this entire week is sponsored by a venture created by the class of 1956, which established for their 40th reunion some years ago, the Frank H.T. Rhodes Class of 1956 University Professorships, visiting professorships. They were established particularly to enrich undergraduate education and to make available to a whole range of undergraduates in our 7 undergraduate colleges at Cornell have the opportunity to meet and converse with, particularly in intimate settings, very distinguished people from various walks of life. This marks the last of the 3 years of General Zinni's appointment as a Rhodes Professor. He has more commitments than I, a very busy person in my own right, can even imagine. And alas, I am somewhat disappointed, I have to say, that these are the last days of this kind of visit that he'll make to Cornell. He has made incredible contributions over the course of his 3-year term as a Rhodes Professor, and today's only Tuesday, the week is not over. We have a bunch of lunches and dinners and conversations with students planned for the rest of the week, and we all look forward to those. Now, just a little bit about General Zinni. I'm sure most of you know about him. To read of his life and all of his daunting accomplishments, I've said before, is a truly humbling experience for someone like me and for most of my colleagues, doubtlessly for all of the students with your lives ahead of you. His distinguished and abundantly decorated military service, his exceptional command leadership as Director of Operations of the Somalia Task Force from 1992 to 1993, his service at the helm of CENTCOM from 1997 until his retirement in 2000, his numerous, countless special diplomatic missions to Turkey, to Pakistan, Kenya, Russia, Yemen, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and there are more than those, as well as his service as Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, Special Envoy to the Middle East from November 2002 to March 2003. That list does not even begin to tell the story of General Zinni's service to the United States in various forms and in various sectors all around the world. He's the author of 3 books, and I should say that he has taught occupying various chairs at 9 universities. He is highly and widely regarded as a man of principle and wisdom, whose qualities of mind and character are captured in the following words he addressed to the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. in October 2002. They're among some of my favorite General Zinni quotes. "Military success in and of itself is never the complete answer. Success will have to be measured, not in military terms, but in political terms, in what is left behind. That will be the mark of what we are, what we leave behind." Finally, I would like to publicly thank him on behalf of those of us at Cornell dedicated to undergraduate education, our very deepest and sincere appreciation for the ease and generosity with which he has engaged undergraduates, our students, exemplifying all of the ideals of the Rhodes Professorship. This afternoon, he's going to speak to us on national security strategy and Iran, something very much in the news, likely to be in the news for quite some time. Please join me in welcoming Rhodes Professor General Anthony Zinni.
Thank you. I've truly enjoyed the 3 years I've been here, and I want to thank the great hospitality that Ross has shown and the faculty and the administration, Michael and all the rest. It's been, I think, a fantastic experience. I want to say that, and I've had 9 chairs. What is great about this chair is what Ross mentioned, the opportunity of the week to spend most of your time with intimate small groups of students. That's really satisfying and impressive. The kinds of questions, the interest, the knowledge, the understanding has tested me in what I thought I knew about a lot. But that environment, I think, it really makes the chair unique, different, and rewarding for someone like me. We talked about the subject for today, Ross and I, an exchange of emails, and we decided to talk about Iran. Usually it's something regarding the Middle East. Last year it was the peace process. And this seems to be the rising issue that's getting most attention. Ahmadinejad is obviously in New York, the UN, and I just saw him on Charlie Rose, nothing new, but you know, it seems to be something that we're heading toward, and I think we're unsure what we're heading toward. The options in dealing with them seem very difficult to determine whether there's going to be a successful outcome or what the right approach is. And so what I'd like to do is maybe talk about a little bit of background. Most of you, especially students I know that are in courses regarding the Near East, Middle East, know much of this. But it's always good to give a little context. I want to start by just saying something about my own personal experience with Iran. And it really goes back to the U.S. Central Command and my time as the commander there during the Clinton administration. When I first arrived at Central Command as the deputy commander and then the commander, probably the biggest concern I had in a region full of crises was that we were going to have an incident with the Iranians that was going to spark something much greater in terms of military terms. That concern was because of the aggressiveness of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Navy. In the Gulf, our ships would constantly be bumped or rammed. There was hostile bridge-to-bridge communication. And fortunately, it was at a time before 9/11 and other times when our commanders, our ship commanders, were very careful, understood what was happening, and didn't overreact. Had that situation been present after 9/11, I don't think we would have allowed their patrol boats and other things to get that close, and that aggressive behavior could have easily triggered something significant that would have maybe escalated beyond anybody's control or intention. That was true until the Khatami election. When Khatami was elected, there was a remarkable change in what happened in these terms. The bridge-to-bridge communications became very professional, not friendly, but professional. The ship rammings or the incidents or the sort of playing chicken with the ships all stopped and ceased. President Clinton at the time was trying to figure out if this marked a change in Iranian attitude or whether there was an opening, and wanted to be very careful about an approach, not to overstretch it, overreach. And he had asked a number of us, what might we do to sort of test the waters? And there were certain diplomatic things that were decided by State Department. If you recall, this again going back to the mid-90s, we lifted the restrictions on carpets and on pistachio nuts, and we had cultural exchanges. Our wrestlers went there. So these were sort of small things to connect. And the president had asked me, could there be something militarily we could do? And we offered some ideas or thoughts about maybe cooperative search and rescue. You know, in the Gulf, if there's a fisherman or a sailor from somebody's forces that falls overboard, could we work a cooperative system? Maybe set up a deconfliction communications net, working with the Arabs on the other side of the Gulf. So we had a number of ideas. And there was a thought that maybe there's some hope here. There's a spark of possibilities. It never went anywhere. I mean, certainly the attitudes were much more relaxed than they are now or they were before, and the atmosphere and the tensions were reduced. It was during a period when we were under the doctrine of dual containment, the Iranians and the Iraqis. Obviously, we were more focused on the Iraqis at the time. But I think the biggest disappointment is that didn't go anywhere. And for reasons that I think frustrated people inside Iran as much as it did outside. A little bit about Iran, at least from my view, a little bit more toward the context. I think Iran has suffered, especially in this last century and the latter part of this century, with the feeling that they don't get any respect. I mean, the Rodney Dangerfield, you don't understand. We are the ancestors of the great Persian culture. We are a significant culture in the world. We should have more respect. We should have more acknowledgement of our power in the region, and that has not been forthcoming. And I think if you go back to at least the end of World War I, this sense that they weren't achieving their status in the region or even globally, that they felt they rated, I think has really stuck in the psyche of Iranians even till now. Their relationships with the United States are interesting because they've been up and down. In some cases, there was a lot of hope for the United States because when the British failed to deliver what the Iranians had expected they might deliver in sort of modernizing the country, an outreach to the West, more engagement, helping their economic development, when it was clear that it was going to be more exploitation, the belief was if the United States replaces Britain in the relationship, this will be a change and will fulfill some of that outreach and some of that commitment, some of that connection, and maybe fulfill some of their expectations. A number of things happened that sort of dampened that, and those of you that are students of history, I'm sure know this. And in the 50s, when they had a legitimate election and Mossadegh was elected as prime minister, he decided to nationalize the energy resources and made other moves, some of which were determined to be maybe more favorable toward the communist parties in the country and toward the East. It's questionable whether that was true or not, but the Brits convinced the United States to help them in unseating him, and so there was an alleged CIA coup that I think everybody acknowledges did occur to unseat Mossadegh. And that maybe was the beginning of a feeling toward the United States about maybe they're just like the Brits, and maybe that this relationship isn't going to reach the kind of fulfilling expectations that we want. Of course, after Mossadegh, we supported the Shah, who came back into power in a big way, and the Shah, of course, was our guy. We had at the time the two-pillar strategy. We were concerned about possible Soviet and communist incursion, involvement in the Middle East, and we decided that we needed to have a structure in the Middle East, and particularly the Persian Gulf, that supported our interests, was basically access to the region, ensuring free flow of energy, freedom of navigation, all the things that still obtain today. And this strategy of two pillars meant that we were going to create two pillars of security strength in the region, Saudi Arabia and Iran, the Shah's Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I think in a way, if what you read about that period of time, the Iranians began to believe, at least the people, that, well, maybe this relationship with the Shah, despite what happened with Mossadegh, still can deliver. But I think the disappointment was the relationship was security-based. And our investment in Iran was basically in military power. And the Shah's demand of the West was a military that most Iranian people felt they didn't need, didn't want. It was high-tech, it was F-14s, it was state-of-the-art military equipment, and at the same time, the economy, the needs of the people weren't being served. So the experience of that relationship was that it was keeping the Shah in power, it was supporting a military buildup, and it wasn't coming down to the Iranian people themselves. The Carter Doctrine at the time stated that we will defend this region. Basically, we will keep the Soviets out. The Carter Doctrine created CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, built on the Readiness Command that was in Florida, and basically originally designed to respond to a military requirement in case the Soviets poured through the Zagros Mountains or some other way of influence out there. And in many respects, because I think it's an important statement about our own national security strategy, we sort of have a collection of legacy strategies and doctrines around the world. I've often complained about where our troops are located around. We're still in Germany, South Korea, Japan. Why? You know, and we have not really rethought our geo-positioning of military forces, our commitments, our involvement. I mean, NATO, we can see in Afghanistan has had problems. And so we have these sort of disparate legacy military or security connections, and we don't have we've lost sort of the art of periodically rethinking our strategy, particularly security strategy. Maybe the last time we did it seriously was George Marshall and Truman and Vandenberg, and that hasn't happened since and needs to. But we sort of have this legacy of the Carter Doctrine, and we are present in a large sense, in the Persian Gulf and in the Middle East with military presence, more so than maybe other elements of government. The Fifth Fleet solely exists in that region for that purpose, and obviously because of Iraq, Afghanistan, and other interests, we have a number of forces there, very large security assistance programs in Saudi Arabia, in much of the Gulf region and elsewhere. And security assistance programs provide the military resources, training, cooperation, coordination, exercises, and all that. And the region seems to be over-militarized from the point of view of most people, and seems to be a commitment of the United States in doing things in what is in our security interests, but doesn't go beyond that, in most people's view, to economic, diplomatic, development, social change, reform, development, and help. So that's sort of an image that's out there. What's interesting about that is those that are maybe more dependent on Middle East energy, the gas and oil that comes out of the Gulf region, don't have that sort of military commitment. Obviously we will occasionally get the odd British ship or French ship that will be there as part of the force, but really it's the United States that provides the military guarantee that the energy needs of China, Japan, Western Europe are all going to be served. It's kind of an unusual relationship, and I want to talk more about that. The dual containment strategy obviously came apart when the Shah fell. And there were some mistakes made, I think, by the regime in Iran then. I think maybe the Ayatollah misplayed the hostage situation when the students took the embassy. That created, obviously, a rift that was great. There was even still a mood at the time that maybe there was some relationship with the United States with the new government that could have been created, but that really soured things on our side tremendously and probably marked our attitude toward Iran ever since in many respects. It's interesting to study the 1979 revolution because the Ayatollah Khomeini was only one element in this revolution. And I think that's important to remember because I'm going to talk a little bit about this green movement that's occurring, which is much the same. He very shrewdly maneuvered to take charge of the revolution, and he owned it in the end. But it wasn't his revolution necessarily. There were a number of groups that revolted against the Shah's regime. And he did some masterful political manipulation to end up on top. And so it became a fundamentalist Islamic revolution in the end, although many parts of that revolution were not necessarily along that track. When the twin pillars failed, the dual containment strategy was then designed to keep both Iraq and Iran at bay. We had in the 1980s the Iraq-Iran War. And probably that is the most significant psychological event in the last 40, 50 years in the minds of all Iranians. I mean, over 1 million killed in the war. World War I style warfare, massive frontal attacks. The Iraqis used gas, their capitals both were bombed, horrendous casualties. There wasn't truly a family in Iran that wasn't affected by the loss of a member in that war. And I think the Iranian people felt that they were attacked, they were wronged, and there was never any acknowledgement of that by the international community or the West or the United States. As a matter of fact, we supported Iraq. We provided military wherewithal to the Iraqis. We were choosing the lesser of two devils at the time and chose Iraq until obviously it became clear that Saddam Hussein was not the kind of person we should be supporting. And so that stuck in their minds very clearly. Again, in this sort of up and down relationship with the United States, it was sort of marked that I think in the minds of Iraqis from that point on, there was no hope for this. And if you remember, it was not just the war, but the Vincennes, the incident where the airliner was shot down by one of our ships in a very aggressive approach to how we were doing business in the region that further added to it and caused these problems. That sort of takes us up to the Iraq-Afghanistan situation. And I think our involvement in Iraq and our reaction to 9/11 in Afghanistan gave the impression inside Iran that they were being surrounded. Prior to that, we created a set of relationships with the Central Asian nations, the STANs, along the Caspian. And so they saw us now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with greater influence to their north and to the Caspian, which they viewed as an Iranian Sea. And now we were creating very strong relationships with those 5 nations and very strong security relationships. Obviously, we went into Iraq, and so now their western border is basically U.S. influenced and occupied. And we went into Afghanistan, and we have the 5th Fleet in the Gulf and in the Arabian Gulf and in the Arabian Sea. So we're this sense of encirclement that was really alarming to them. And I think after a while, they understood that maybe they needed to help or cooperate in some ways. Our first involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, they actually did some things that were helpful to us. And I think it became a shock to them when they heard the axis of evil speech by President Bush, which then really, I think, clearly indicated that we didn't see that help in any way. We weren't reaching out. We weren't attempting to open up. So this sense of being classified with Iraq and North Korea on the axis of evil, this geographic encirclement as they saw it, I think really hardened their approach to doing business with us, understanding what their position is and motivating them to do other things. And that kind of brings us to where we are today. And I want to give you sort of a sense of what the attitude or the view is, maybe from inside Iraq. Some of this I gathered by talking to some people inside Iraq in a forum that I can't describe in great detail to you because the people involved in the process did not want to be identified for obvious reasons. So attitude from the streets, from the Green Movement, and from others. There is now a rise, a very, I think, a rise in power of something that should concern us, of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Recently, Secretary Clinton talked about this militarization of their regime. And if you look at the Iranian regime and you saw a diagram of it, it is a Rube Goldberg collection of things that makes it hard to understand who's really in charge. They have these councils and assemblies. You have the Supreme Leader, Guardian Council, you know, the Assembly of Experts. You have the Majlis. You have the President. You have a military force in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. You have the normal Ministry of Defense. And so there's this sort of distributed power that is hard to figure who really is the voice. And then even in some of those that would be classified the hardliners in charge, there seems to be splits at times. Rafsanjani and Khatami opposing Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, as we saw at the after effects of the last election. So the whole idea of who do you talk to, who's really in charge, becomes difficult to ascertain and to sort out in that kind of government, in that kind of structure, and adds to confusion. And the power on the surface seems to be distributed, but where it really lies is hard to understand. And the rise of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard and its tentacles reaching into the other organizations and into the other elements of power has been concerning as to seeing what its rise was. It was created by the Ayatollah in 1979 to be some sort of force of ensuring the Islamic fundamentalist approach to things, and it's now become a power that's grown of its own accord. There has clearly not been any interest in a dialogue with the United States. Even at the time of Khatami, when it seemed most promising, as I said before, we never had that kind of response or reaction to the approaches in any real sense. And I don't think anybody in the potential lineup over there sees any advantage to that. If anything, right now, the mood is looking east to China. They see China, Russia possibly, as where their interests lie. They see no need, no advantage for a dialogue with the United States, much for the reasons I described before, but they don't see any advantage even from a practical sense right now. And China and Russia seem to them to fill some of the needs they need externally, and obviously to keep a position in the Security Council and elsewhere that might stave off sanctions or other things that might affect them. They're really betting on China at this point, as one of the Iranians told me. They have seen an opportunity with us in Iraq to begin to create an arc, almost a counter-encirclement. With a Shia-dominated government in Iraq, the opportunity to use that to geographically connect into Syria, where they have a relationship, you know, almost an alliance, and then into Lebanon with Hezbollah, into the Palestinian territories with Hamas. I think they see that as a strategic arc to begin to maybe counter-encircle our interests and work it very hard. It was interesting when I was out in the region after we had gone in, just as we were going into Iraq, I was with two Arab friends, and the President Bush was on TV, and he was talking about our incursion into Iraq, and he was describing this as the forces of democracy and freedom now fighting the forces of tyranny and dictatorship. And one of my Arab friends said, elbowed me and said, "It's not it. It's Shia versus Sunni." And he says, "You've unleashed the devil." And the other one nudged me and he says, "You unleashed another devil. It's Persian against Arab." And probably all those things are true, even President Bush's statement to a certain extent, but I don't think we had an appreciation of the impact of that. The first Shia-dominated Arab nation in the sense of population, what the implications may be for other Arab nations with big Shia populations, some of which are actual majorities, like in Bahrain, and the effects of the eastern provinces in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and elsewhere. Igniting that kind or unleashing that devil that they've tried not to have happen out there and what it means. And also the Persian-Arab conflict, which has been traditional, historic, and igniting something that might effectively spark that into something bigger. Inside the country, there are tremendous social, economic, and political problems. It's interesting to look at the Green Movement because it is a collection of movements. It is not one movement. It doesn't have a single purpose. There are women's groups, there are journalist groups, there are workers groups. It is sort of much like the 1979 revolution. It is a collection of groups that have problems with the government and want to see change. If there's a common thread that I gathered from talking to those involved in this movement is they don't want a violent revolution. They are trying to effect change in a nonviolent way. There are certain elements that maybe would resort to violence, but it's very much a minority. They really want to try to execute this change within the construct of the Constitution they have, which has made it very difficult. They've tried to do things that are basically civil disobedience, sort of nonviolent kinds of strikes and things, and they paid a tremendous price for it. They're extremely disappointed in not having the reaction they thought they would get in the demonstrations after the elections from the United States and from the West. They felt it was very muted. It really took the wind out of their sails. In many ways, they were looking for more support, not necessarily military support or anything like that, or intervention in some way, but support in terms of speaking out, of highlighting what was going on, of helping them with more communication, supporting and reinforcing some of the exiles that have influence and power to communicate their message and to help them with their internal communication. They're extremely worried about sanctions because if sanctions come, they fear it will come down on the people and it will really dampen the movement because then they will really be alienated. And of course, we should have learned a lesson from Iraq, from the oil for food and the other sanctions, in that the impact was felt greatest down at the lowest levels where it wasn't intended to affect. So the idea of sanctions and what it might mean in coming down on a population that's already pretty strapped economically and otherwise, and in terms of their freedoms, this makes it seem even worse as an outcome if we go in that direction. What's the worldview? I talked to members of the European Union about this, and the European Union as an entity feels strongly that they want to create a dialogue. They still hang to the hope that there can be a dialogue. Maybe they can even broker this. They engage many of the groups and many of the Iranians, and they're struggling very hard to create some sort of communication link to get out of this mess. It's not been very successful by their own admission, but they really want to pursue that as opposed to have something stronger with sanctions or military action or something else to come up. I'm convinced that the Europeans will go along with sanctions if the time comes. France has said that, Sarkozy, and certainly the United Kingdom, so they would support sanctions in the end. The regional views are mixed. If you went to the other side of the Gulf, you would find some countries that feel some nations very strongly about Iran as the enemy. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. You would find others that worry about it and see it as a regional hegemon on the rise, but want to be very careful about not taking a strong stand. Some countries like Qatar obviously have a relation. They share a natural gas field with Iran. They have some economic ties, and some countries that just worry about eruption of another conflict in the region, what it might mean. I found it interesting that some of the nations in the region have actually gamed out military action. How would they fare? What would happen? What are their best courses of action should this thing get sparked by some sort of strike on our part, the Israelis' part? How would this all work out and come down? And it's tough to get the region to take sort of a cohesive stand in terms of Iran. But I still don't think we have sort of worked that as much as we could, because it's clear, you know, even though some will not talk about it publicly or brand Iran the enemy publicly, they will still tell you that is their concern. This is the threat that they see that's greatest in the region and rising, and concerned about our reaction and their reaction. Obviously, key to us is the Security Council, and particularly Russia and China. Russia might come over in terms of sanctions, and I say that because the administration has done a couple of things, like canceled the program to put defensive missile systems in Poland and Czechoslovakia. We've now signed up to this arms reduction treaty with Russia, and could there be a quid for that in the Iranian sanctions? And that's what seems to me we're working very hard. China, on the other hand, I think would be very difficult to bring around, and China would be the key in any kind of international sanctions with any clout or power. Obviously, the biggest regional issue is Israel. And Israel has obviously the Begin Doctrine that they will not allow a potential enemy to possess weapons of mass destruction. And that doctrine is what had them preemptively attack in Iraq, the facility, and then in Syria more recently. And they obviously see Iran as an existential threat, and see that red line of having a capability to weaponize as something that truly threatens their very existence and is intolerable. And how is that going to be managed with the United States and with our interest in the region? It kind of leads us to our position in all this, and maybe the gist of this talk. The mood here, obviously, in Congress, I've talked to a number of congressmen and senators and staffers. They certainly are geared up for punitive actions against Iran. They see Iran clearly as an aggressive state working against our interests. They see a clear threat to Israel, the Gulf, to our forces in Iraq. There's also tremendous concern about proliferation as a result of Iran getting a capability. What will the Saudis do? What will the Egyptians do? Even countries like the United Arab Emirates that could possibly feel they need the capability to sort of counter this, and now we have started a regional proliferation that cannot be controlled in some ways. There's obviously concern about support for terrorism through the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, the MOIS, and the idea that something has to be done and a red line has to be set pretty much is the mood of Congress. Administration concerned about that. You know, what does that mean? If you set the red line down, it means you have to do something about it when they cross it. And what is the red line? Is the red line a sufficient amount of enriched uranium? Is it actual weaponization? Depends who you talk to. I mean, I've talked to Israeli leaders about this, and the red line's way over here. I've talked to some American leaders, or maybe it's much further out. And there was even talk at one time by certain leaders about what if they got the capability? Is it feasible to have a policy or a strategy of containment? And no one wants to talk about that, but that's even been discussed. At one time, General Abizaid, who was the commander of CENTCOM, sort of floated that thought about how would we contain a nuclear-armed Iran if that were the case, to avoid getting into some of the options that maybe are more difficult to put in place. And so what are those options? Well, let's take the ones that maybe are easiest to understand, sanctions. If we're able to convince the Security Council, which is problematic, we implement sanctions. How effective can sanctions be? How can we have targeted sanctions that don't go down and affect the people? They're fairly blunt in the way they get administered. Would they be effective? Would you get enough international cooperation not to have holes in the sanction regime? Tied with sanction would be some form of containment. That containment would require some way of much like we did with Iraq and during the days of dual containment, it's required additional military forces. We have to look at their trade routes and their communication routes and how do we interdict that, how do we impose it, would we get international support, cooperation, and participation in those things. The other idea or thought is obviously a military strike. And now here, having been the commander of U.S. Central Command, what I always told my bosses when they talked about military strikes is you can't plan against intentions or what you think might happen. Remember when we went into Iraq, we had our wonderful strategists to tell us that it would be a cakewalk, it would be flowers in the streets. And any of us that knew Iraq knew that wasn't going to happen. And of course it didn't happen. And those that think Iran will eat a strike, in other words, take it and do nothing, I think are betting against something that is highly improbable. And so you have to prepare yourself for what might they do. And they have some capabilities to create problems for us. First of all, they have a significant missile system, the Shahab series, third generation working on fourth generation. As I'm sure you know and you've read and you've heard, they can hit Israel and most of the regions in the Gulf. They're mobile, so they're hard to find, hard to get at. They definitely will get some off. What might they hit? Well, they might hit Israel. They might hit our troop bases on the other side of the Gulf, in Iraq and along the Gulf, our forces that are out there. They might even hit an oil field or a gas processing place. What would happen to the economy of the world if suddenly an oil field in that region of the world went up? They can flood the Gulf with mines. I mean, they did it during the Iran-Iraq war. They have these dhows and fast patrol boats, again, loaded with mines. They can get them in the water. The threat of mines, even if a ship is hit, not damaged greatly, will impact the price of energy resources out of there and have a tremendous effect. Their fast patrol boats with cruise missiles are hard to pick up on radar, very difficult to manage. Eventually we would deal with them. They have 3 submarines that could get out, and we would eventually deal with them, but could they do some damage before that all comes about? Certainly. And of course you have the MOIS and the activation of sleeper cells, terrorists, and then a reaction in the Islamic world about another Muslim country preemptively attacked. I mean, I'm giving you the story that would come out of Tehran. You know, why are we not entitled to the bomb? You know, and why is it Muslim countries have to be preemptively attacked? We hit no one. We struck no one. You know, and how will that theme carry and what will it mean? What would it mean to our allies on the other side of the Gulf if this happens? How long could they sustain support from us, allowing us to have bases there, operate from them if they're under pressure from this? Will they trust that we will support them? Remember not too long ago when Secretary Clinton talked about putting Iran, our allies in the region under our nuclear umbrella and our protection. There was a lot of noise about that here. Will there be guarantees? Will we stick to it? There's a tremendous line that is given by the Osama bin Ladens and the Ahmadinejads in the region as they go around. Remember Vietnam, you know, when Americans pulled out. And the president was Nixon, you know, hard-nosed Republican. Remember Beirut, and the president was Reagan, another hard-nosed. These aren't, you know, softy liberals that pulled out. They left after they got a bloody nose. Remember the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia when the barracks of the Air Force was bombed and we left the provinces. Remember Yemen and the USS Cole when it was hit. We've never been back in Yemen again. So will America stay? You can see the mood in getting out of Iraq. So this is the line that comes up there, and it could affect our allies if they feel threatened. Much of the time I spend in the region, I hear stories about Ahmadinejad coming across the Gulf, talking to the leadership on the other side, and telling them how we're Muslim brothers and all this, which they don't buy, but in the end always leaving with a veiled threat about that kind of support and the support for the United States and our presence in the region. So that becomes a difficult thing to manage. It's also hard to see how a strike comes about. Should the Israelis decide to strike, they would have to tell us, because I don't think any Israeli leader would leave our troops exposed out there. A strike happens and they didn't tell us. We manage the airspace over Iraq and elsewhere they would need. If that were to occur and the counterattacks came on us and we were not prepared, you can imagine the reaction here. If they were to tell us we're now complicit, we would feel certainly obliged to protect our own forces in the region. And so suddenly an aluminum cloud of airplanes bringing Patriot missiles in would tell our friends in the region, our allies on the other side where we have bases, what's happening. And if you're putting all these Patriots around your positions, what about us? And maybe if you're not going to protect us or you're going to do something without informing us, maybe it's time for you to leave or shut down operations. So this becomes problematic if you look at how you would orchestrate this thing to begin with. So those that favor military action or military strike, I always recall the advice I received from Newt Gingrich when I was a general. He said, General, he said, anytime one of your political masters tells you to do something, take a military action, always ask the question, and then what? You know, make them drill down to the second, third order effects and make them go all the way down to the end. Because if you don't ask those questions, unfortunately, I think the military didn't in Iraq and elsewhere, they seem to think, you know, they think about an inch deep, as he said. And they think in terms of the one action and what might happen, and not the repercussions, what we're going to have to live with, what we could create, all the effects that are going to happen at an order second and third levels down, which become key. So in the end, this becomes a difficult decision. I think there are some areas that we ought to explore more, however. One of them I already mentioned. There are two things the Iranians, I think, fear most. One is the internal unrest, the reformers, the Green Movement. And like I said before, have we done enough to support that, to encourage it, to demonstrate our sympathy and support for what they're doing? We certainly didn't in their eyes when they were in the streets after the election. It's still alive, but it's under tremendous oppression and repression in all over Iran. And can we leverage that more? Can we play up the internal dissent and the lack of freedom? Certainly the youth of the country want to come out from under this, as do all those other groups, and certainly want to reach out to get some of the benefits of modernity and don't see themselves as this kind of very restrictive fundamentalist country, see themselves much more secular, which seems to be in the nature of their society. The other issue, which I sort of touched on, that I think we could leverage more, is building more regional cooperation and giving more regional assurances to go along with that. I think the other thing that the Iranians fear is that the region would organize in a way that leaves them out. And the reason Ahmadinejad goes across the Gulf and makes these veiled threats and is trying to push us out is they want to be the dominant power in the region and recognize this so. If the region were to form some sort of security alliance with maybe the US and the UK and others in support, and that alliance did not have Iran in it, and it did things for its own security, it doesn't even have to identify an enemy as such, but it did something like develop a cooperative air and missile defense throughout the region, did some other things that helped their collective security. And Iran was on the outside, I think that would have a tremendous reaction. They would fear that more than they fear a potential US-Israeli strike or action, because then you have co-opted the very people they want to be in a dominant position over. And so I think that there's money to be made in those two areas that we haven't, I think, explored enough. We spend a lot of time now in trying and betting the ranch on the sanctions and getting them. And I fear they may not get us the results we want, and we might end up with a failure in the Security Council on top of it. And I think military action, for all the reasons I mentioned, becomes tremendously problematic. Not to mention the fact our own military and how stretched it is. To engage in a third war, which would make Iraq and Afghanistan pale in comparison in a strained military situation we have now, to me is unimaginable to think we can do that. And I think, as I said, you have to plan against capabilities, not intentions. And you have to assume, if you're going to initiate conflict with Iran, that this thing is going to erupt into something that's going to be long-lasting and very difficult, far more involved and difficult than the Iraq or the Afghan conflicts. So with that, I'm glad to take any questions and give my best shot to any questions or comments you might have. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate more on the role of China?
I think China's motivation is their degree of influence. There's not one Chinese ship or one Chinese soldier in the Gulf. I mean, we take care of that business and the security. And we ensure, like I said, the free flow of energy and access to the region. So their involvement can be diplomatic, development work, economic investment. When I was in Saudi Arabia, I was amazed at the amount of Chinese investment there. And what I heard from some of the Saudis, senior Saudis, where's the U.S. investment? You know, we would encourage it, and it looks promising. The Saudis, if this reform continues, economic reform and other things, it could be something in the future that is economically worth investing in. They're revamping their education system, trying to diversify their economy, and do other things. Chinese are right there. Chinese build roads. Chinese, have a strong diplomatic presence. They do humanitarian things in the region. They do everything that's non-military, and I think they see in the long run that, first of all, if the U.S. has a problem there, why do they want to help fix it? You know, why isn't that in their interest? Secondly, could they supplant the U.S. By being involved in a non-military, non-security way? Because it's much easier. The soft power approach, as opposed to the hard power approach, is better received. They don't come with much historical baggage in some cases. So I think their interest right now is to say, what is in our interest here? How can we gain the upper hand, be the most influential international entity in the region? If they determine, if we're able to convince them it's not in their interest to have a nuclear-armed Iran, it's destabilizing a set of problems, you could maybe get a vote in the Security Council. I don't see it right now. Certainly, I think the Russians are more likely to come over now because we've made some concessions with them. But they have issues with us, and this is a leverage point on us that they have too.
So what changes if economically, politically, and militarily if Iran becomes a nuclear military power?
I'm not sure, because in terms of nukes, you either have a lot or you have none. It seems to me having a few doesn't get you anywhere, or having a capability less than those that might react to your use of it or attempt to intimidate with it doesn't gain you anywhere. I mean, if Iran needed a model, look at North Korea. I mean, it's a society that's about ready to implode. It doesn't really have any close allies. The Chinese are the closest, but still, I don't think that they're willing to, commit to the defense of North Korea in any way. They don't see that in their interest. They don't obviously want us to become a dominant power in the region, and the whole dialogue around North Korea goes to their position as such. So what does it get you? I mean, this goes back to the Abizaid and others that say, if they had it, what could they do with it? It's not a suicidal regime. You never know down the road what might happen, but certainly Iranians, and actually Shia, don't tend to be suicidal, but Iranians don't tend to be suicidal. This sort of last defiant act to launch something that is the end for you. I mean, even our president has made statements to that effect. So can it be, now those in the region, the Arab countries in the region do feel it will have an intimidating effect, and that they'll need at least a guarantee from us. And they don't want to be driven to create their own capabilities. They feel they may be trapped into that if this occurs. So how they leverage that in terms of intimidation is difficult to see. We would have to be very strong in the way we counter to any potential intimidation, which would require commitments. Maybe requires forced presence and requires other things that we would have to commit to ensure the intimidation doesn't have any viability to it. This is much what we did in Korea. I mean, the reason we put troops along the DMZ was that any attack by North Korea immediately was an attack on the United States. We certainly didn't need infantry troops on the DMZ. The South Korean Army, in that sense, is even more formidable than North Korean, but it was because of having that tripwire. You can't do anything without tripping over the United States and therefore engaging the United States. So those are the kinds of commitments that may be necessary to reduce the intimidation. And again, if they possess it and actually have it weaponized, that might be a stronger case for international sanctions. Difficult for anybody to back off of that. So it's hard to see the advantage they get unless we aren't committed. then it can be an intimidating factor in the region. And then the dangers of what that may mean in terms of pushing us out, so that that would be the card that they would want to play through intimidation, and the ability to maybe cause a rise in proliferation throughout the region. As I said, countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, even UAE and others.
Can you see any way for the U.S. to preserve its interests within the Middle East with a reduced force there?
I do. You know, Secretary Gates has been clamoring that our whole foreign policy is over-militarized. And I agree with him. And I think most military leaders would agree with that, too. The other Ds, diplomacy and development, and the other approaches, the so-called soft power, hasn't had the strength or the resources to match up with the hard power. And the military's actually had to fall into doing a lot of that. And the military's not the best instrument for that sort of thing either. He has done some things, like he's canceled some major programs like F-22, Army's Future Combat System. He is now going to look at where we are around the world, where our commitments are, where we're positioned. Is it right? Or are these, as I said before, legacy commitments that have outlived their usefulness and structure? Can you do business in another way? I mean, do you have to be there full-time, 24/7? Can you make commitments in terms of diplomacy and security arrangements, maybe through exercises in more limited ways, less of a visible presence? And I think this Pentagon is really into this and looking hard at this now. First of all, I think Secretary Gates sees the value of a balanced power. He wants to see State Department, USAID, and others brought up to a position where their influence is as great as the military's, or it's brought into certainly balance. He's even offered the budget crossover to support this sort of thing, and supported it. And it's driven by the realities of what you said about budget and cost, you know, to be able to maintain it, hard decisions, risks you may have to take because of it. It's driven by a need to rethink our place in the world, our power and purpose, our strategy, rethink our alliances and relationships around the world. And I think rethink clearly, and I think this is a big part of the way Secretary Gates thinks, rethink about how it's received. If the image there of the United States is always a soldier or a sailor, that's not what you want. You want the image to be something certainly different from that. I mean, certainly where we have security requirements and where we have mutual security requirements, we want to ensure we get that done in the best way. But your only approach being a military one, and your only basis for connection a security one, that becomes very limited. And definitely down onto the street with the people, they don't see the advantages to that necessarily. I mean, see, that's what's going on in Pakistan and everywhere else. I mean, that's why the Kerry-Lugar bill, originally Biden-Lugar bill, made the approach that we want to tell a country like Pakistan, we no longer want to deal with you in a security transactional basis, basically based on our security interests. We want to demonstrate that your stability is important to us, and your stability is more than just military forces and police. It's your education system, it's your economic system, and we're willing to invest in it. And so they proposed a bill of resources and funding and support for those things. And so I think clearly we can't afford this continuous military approach, and it isn't as effective. The military buys you security. Security just creates a temporary environment that in and of itself isn't going to resolve issues or create stability. In the long term, when you do provide military support, and in terms of security assistance and building up militaries and police, they could become the instruments that cause a lot of the instability in the end too. We've certainly seen that. And so this balance is long overdue from our approach. And I think that certainly the attitude of the Pentagon is there needs to be more balance in this.
Do you see a significant relationship between U.S. efforts toward oil independence and its relationship with Iran? And if you see that kind of relationship, what sort of dimensions do you think it would have?
I think in the long term, energy, we need an energy strategy. We need to look to alternative sources of energy. It's not going to be a short-term solution. It's not going to be a short-term. I mean, we're dreaming to think that suddenly tomorrow there's 58,000 windmills off the coast and we're all satisfied that it runs everything that we need. It's not going to happen. Our dependency on on foreign oil and natural gas and other things. It's going to be with us for a while. Even if we suddenly designed an alternative source and came up with it, and it would take a half a century to make it effectively make us totally independent and be able to transform those things that need that kind of energy. So there is no short-term solution to that. And by the way, what's really interesting, the energy resources are fungible. I mean, people seem to, I always hear these quotes about, well, we only need 15% of Middle East oil, where the Europeans need 47%, the Japanese 70%, the Chinese some ungodly amount. It isn't sliced that way. Oil goes into one big pot, and it's sold, based on who's willing to pay for it. You can say our dependence is less than anybody else, and yet we ensure its access and its free flow. I think we need to think through how internationally that free flow is maybe managed and ensured in some ways. And again, I think we really do need an energy strategy and how to approach international requirements and needs and better managing it and securing it and ensuring its access and its flow and its distribution. That would be more important in the short term. When I say short term, I'm talking 50 years, basically, from what I know of energy requirements.
Liz?
Yes. I'm wondering, given the kind of triangulated relationship between Iran's population and its government in the U.S., what a U.S. program of soft power would look like?
Most Iranians really want access to information. They want internet access. They want, obviously, the level of sophisticated technical communication capability that we have, and I think that's a great leverage point to ensure that leads positively to a lot of other things and helps them inside. I think the most significant thing is economics and social reform and change. And those are the two that get the most leverage. I think that their economy is in trouble. They really need to have an economic boost. Sanctions are going to really hit hard down and make it very difficult. So I think in terms of communication, information access, economic assistance and cooperation, helping them support their own reforms and social change, role of women and other things that they're pushing in, because there's a very strong voice for things like that inside. That would be the best approaches. But getting past a hardline regime to make that happen becomes more difficult. But advertising that and making that sort of the promise is something that could get you more leverage and support from internal support. It's certainly where the youth is and their head is.
We have to stop now, so I want to thank General Zinni and everyone for coming out today, and have a great end of the semester.
Thank you.